Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today to talk about this really important topic of inclusivity in tech. And we have two fabulous people here with expertise to give you some new insights, and also we'll be having a good 15 minutes to take your questions at the end of the session. So glad that you're here. My name is Michelle Rapp. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Career Strategy in the Office of Alumni Relations. So I put on career programs like this for alums, and students are welcome to, and staff. And so let me go into the introductions. Alexandra Siegel is Vice President and Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Expedia Group. In her role, she drives diversity and inclusion transformation by designing inclusive talent processes, enablement, and content. Previously, Ali was a founding leader of Salesforce's Office of Equality. She helped reimagine the organization's hiring and promotions processes, established the inclusive learning and content functions, led Global Employee Resource Group strategy, and helped chair the Racial Equality and Justice Task Force. She began her diversity and inclusion career as the global president of Salesforce's Black Employee Resource Group, Bold Force. Ali was named Business Insider's 30 and Under Rising Stars in Tech and nominated for AdColor's Change Agent Award for her impact, including defining industry-wide inclusive marketing principles. And she studied journalism at Northeastern. Dr. Laney Strange will be interviewing Ali. She is an associate teaching professor and area chair and director of broadening participation at Northeastern's Corey College of Computer Sciences. Inside and outside the classroom, she works on making computer science inclusive and welcoming for students who have been historically marginalized in the tech industry. Laney strongly believes that computer science is for everyone, and a typical Saturday morning will find her teaching women's community of code programming workshops that empower girls and women to try out coding in a fun, supportive environment. Thank you both for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Laney.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. Hey, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thanks for joining us. I even see some familiar names out there. So hi, everybody from class. It's good to see you. So my name is Laney Strange, and I am here to interview Ali Siegel, who has done, as you just heard from Michelle, all these like amazing and wonderful things in her career. And Ali, we heard that your current job title is Vice President and Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion. And that sounds like a big job. It sounds really important. It sounds like it could have a lot of impact. I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about what that current role is like. And we know there was a lot of stuff leading up to it, but just what you're up to right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So currently in my role, I really look at how can we make the most inclusive workplace possible, starting with our processes. So the way we hire, attract, retain, advance our talent, especially our underrepresented talent or marginalized talent. How do we make sure we're doing that in an equitable, inclusive way, and that we're widening access as much as possible into the opportunities that exist in tech and into our corporate fields. And so Expedia Group is actually a travel tech company. You've probably heard of it or used Expedia or one of our brands to book a trip. And so for me, it was really exciting to join a company that aligns so directly with my personal passions of travel, and their vision is that travel can be a force for good. So that just felt really aligned to who I am as a person.
That's great. Thank you. And so this role that you've just described, is this something that you sort of envisioned for yourself when you were younger? Is this was this a goal on your career path when you were starting out?
Absolutely not. I had no idea that this was a career or a job that someone could have. When I was at Northeastern, I envisioned myself being a journalist. I was going to, be an international journalist. I did a dialogue in Jordan and Turkey studying journalism. I think when I graduated, I was kind of disillusioned with the field. It was going through this transition where it was moving from print to social media and just having a hard time. And one of my friends had moved into technology, actually another Northeastern alumni, and had moved out to the Bay Area, was working for a startup, And his life just seemed so cool. He was, sitting, like working by the pool, and just seemed to like really be enjoying himself at work, which those were two things I never really thought could be the same, like enjoyment and have a corporate career. So he convinced me that my skill sets as a journalist actually translated into a content marketer in tech. And I said, but I don't know anything about machine learning or AI or whatever this company is about. And he said, you're a journalist. You know how to research and figure it out. You can figure this out. So that's what brought me into tech. And then just being in tech, my journalism mind never turned off. And I just noticed that I never saw many women in high ranking positions, absolutely. And then absolutely even less than for people of color. And then I almost never saw another Black person around me. And that just bothered me and didn't sit well with me. And so I started to explore, well, how can we make folks aware of the problem that exists? That's clearly a systemic problem, because every company was hovering around 2% Black employees and less than 30% women at the time. And eventually I actually created the job that I had when I was at Salesforce. And that's a whole story. And that's what kind of brought me to this path. So definitely not a linear path by any means.
All right, that's awesome. But now we have to hear that story. So you created a role for yourself at Salesforce. So what was your job title when you started there?
I think my job title was like technology content strategist or something like that. I don't know. I was an individual contributor. I was early in my career. And it was fine, but I just felt like something was missing. I wanted that passion in my role. I wanted to align with my passions and higher purpose. And so I started to work with our Black Employee Resource Group. For those of you who don't know, a lot of companies have what we call employee resource groups, which are very similar to student groups. And they're really a way for underrepresented communities to come together, build community, and drive change within their organizations. And so I started meeting with them to think through, okay, how can we elevate the conversation of racial equality? How can we start to use our perspective to influence recruiting practices and the culture here? And started to talk to experts. I learned that diversity inclusion was a field. So I started just calling, different practitioners and seeing if I could build my own skill sets around facilitating and helping to have these conversations. And then I just kind of became known as the person to go to when you had a question related to this topic, and was able to build a great network of mentors within the business. And it was actually a mentor of mine who said, you light up when you talk about these topics. Why don't you make this your job? And I was like, well, this isn't a job. This is just what I do on the side. And she said, why not? I mean, other people have created their role before. Why can't you do it? And so she really helped me to pull together a pitch deck, make the business case of why we needed this role. And eventually I had to pitch that all the way up to the chief marketing officer, which just was intimidating because, again, I was early in my career. So that's like many levels between me and those folks I was pitching to. And they said yes. And eventually it became part of a much wider initiative to bring on a chief diversity officer who I then reported to, and everything grew from there.
That's awesome. I wonder if you could dive a little bit more into just that one tiny thing you mentioned of like calling other practitioners, people doing the thing that you wanted to be doing. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like in terms of like, if someone else is thinking about doing something like that, are you taking people out for coffee? Are you asking for advice? Like, what is this actually looking like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you really can't underestimate just reaching out to people who you admire, whose career you admire, who you'd like to learn from. I mean, yes, a lot of people are maybe not going to respond to your LinkedIn or maybe say no, but a lot of people are going to say yes. A lot of people want to talk about their experience. They want to help. They want to pass down the knowledge that they've learned. So, I mean, every job that I've had up until this last job was just me reaching out to someone who had a job that I was interested in and saying like, is there anything like that I can strive for myself, or anything I can learn from you? And that's how I got connected to the next opportunity. So it takes courage. It's actually something I learned from journalism at Northeastern, that courage to just cold call someone or reach out and get over that fear of rejection. And, that's going to take you places.
Yeah, that's great. So that's sort of a really specific way that your background in journalism was sort of helpful in moving your career forward. Can you talk about other ways in which like your work at Northeastern or your early career prepared you for what you're working on now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, now that I look back, I just think Northeastern is one of the main reasons that I was able to have such an accelerated career path. And I didn't realize at the time, even compared to some of my peers who went to other schools at the same time as me, but just that preparation for the business world, like those co-ops, giving you a safe space to fail and make mistakes and learn how to speak the corporate language or sit in on meetings where people are pitching a business case or learning about budgets. You're already light years ahead of others when you graduate. So, a lot of times I was maybe the youngest person in the room or maybe the lowest level in the room, but I was able to speak their language because I had those experiences. So I think that was really important. Definitely my experience in journalism and the dialogues, just really opening up my mind to the different cultures, possibility, even this idea of, I didn't know we were talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, but I think those dialogue experiences really embed that in you as a principle, because then you go into the corporate world and you still have that mindset, that global mindset. And then I do have a story that I would love to share that really inspired me, especially as a woman or as someone underrepresented in tech. So when I was at Northeastern, I did have an experience with a professor where I was experiencing a lot of microaggressions. It happened to be a white male professor, and didn't know the word microaggression at the time. I think that's a newer term, but that's what I was experiencing. And I remember going to the head of the department at the time for help, super nervous. I was like shaking going into this meeting, like, what if I fail this class? What if she doesn't listen to me? And I just remember her saying, your whole career, you're going to have men in positions of power try to take away your power or try to diminish you. And we as women, we need to support each other and we need to never allow that to happen. And I think just that act of advocacy, feeling seen, feeling heard, feeling community, feeling like you're not in this alone, that's something that I've really aimed to replicate in corporate spaces. Like, how do we create that in these corporate spaces where just honestly, with all of you, you are probably going to be one of only or one of few in the room sometimes. And that could be extremely hard. But when you have that community that has your back, or you have a leader that has your back, it just makes it so much easier.
That's great. So when you talk about that sort of advocacy role that we can play for each other, you're obviously now in a position of leadership where there's a lot of things that you can do. How would you say someone who's like just starting out in their career can work to support those around them?
I mean, there's so much that I think about the early days of my career, and, we were really in it together, like especially the Black Employee Resource Group, like trying to figure out, okay, this person is really passionate about this, and I heard this person is really knowledgeable about that. Let me connect them. Or this person is kind of struggling. How do we help them work through that problem or get them connected to someone who can support them? So you don't have to be in a position of power to have power. And there's definitely more strength in numbers and community. And so I think the more you can build community and build that support system, and I think in corporate spaces or anywhere where there are power dynamics, people can feel the pressure to compete with one another versus support one another. But I've always found that you will have so much more success if you are working to support one another versus compete or tear someone down.
Yeah. So you, in your role at Expedia, you're sort of working on the talent within Expedia and what you bring in. Do you feel that you have an impact on the broader tech world as well?
I mean, absolutely. Every time a tech company does something that's on the leading edge here, other companies follow. And I've seen the space evolve so much in just the 5 or 6 years that I've been in the DEI space, where when we started, we were just talking about gender, binary gender, really. That was the main topic when you talked about diversity and inclusion. And now we've evolved so much where then we were talking about racial equality, then we were talking about equity, then we were talking about intersectionality, then we're talking about, well, what does justice look like in talent processes, which is like a deeper level of the conversation, and you start to move the whole industry forward. So I really believe you can make a difference. One person, one company can definitely make a difference for the industry.
Yeah. So I wonder if you were giving advice to someone who's sort of new and starting out in their career, and they're interviewing for a co-op or their first full-time job, and they want to get a sense of how inclusive a company is or how committed they really are to diversity and inclusion. I feel like a lot of companies now will have a chief diversity officer or chief inclusion officer. It doesn't necessarily translate into a welcoming and supportive work environment. Do you have any advice for how you can assess that as part of like the interview process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are a few ways. I think it's one thing to have a diversity team or diversity officer, but are they actually tracking and publishing their data? So a lot of companies that are serious about this will publicly share their representation data and update it on a regular basis. So, I mean, that means that at least they're held accountable to changing and to evolving, even if they're not perfect. So I think that's an important one. I think finding out what a company's values are, usually they have them on the website somewhere, making sure diversity or inclusion or belonging is one of those values, then asking questions about how those values show up in the workplace. Also, I'd say asking about employee resource groups. Do they have them? How do they support them? That's a really important question as well. So those are just a few. And then I think it's hard because there's not one company that I can think of that is doing this super well. They're just not. So I think it's really about how do you assess the commitment? How do you assess that they're actually taking action and they're not just putting it on the website?
Right. So in terms of making things public, you were talking about sort of releasing data and things. I was just wondering what you think about, there's been sort of a recent trend. It just happened in New York where they're requiring companies to publish a salary range. And I wonder if you think of this as a diversity issue as well, and if that's something that you think more companies should be doing.
Absolutely. I mean, I think equal pay is tightly connected to transparency. And a lot of times when we look at the gender pay gap and then the racial pay gap, a lot of it is because, one, we don't know what we should be asking for because we don't have as many folks in our networks to even tell us, or folks who've done this before us, or our parents to tell us, this is really what you should be asking for. This is how you negotiate. There's also a lot of systemic bias that is connected to the gap and why some people are offered one offer and some people are offered another. And I think some companies are taking it really seriously. For example, Salesforce, they had invested over $16 million to close the pay gap and make sure everyone was paid equally, and we would do it every single year. But I think laws like that are important to drive accountability to make sure that, everyone is adhering to better practices.
Yeah. You mentioned employee resource groups a couple of times. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, sort of a little bit about what they are and how they've been useful to you in your career.
Yes, I'm very passionate about employee resource groups, if you can't tell. So employee resource groups, they are employee-led organizations. They are typically connected to identity. So for example, I led our Black employee resource group for a while, but they have employee resource groups for women, people with disabilities, LGBTQ+, and so many different aspects of identity. And what I think is really fantastic about employee resource groups is it's a great way to gain leadership experience early in your career and be in spaces and rooms where you may not have had that opportunity. And it also is a way to really build community and that support system and that network that is going to last for years to come. I mean, I still keep in contact with so many of those folks that I worked with in the employee resource groups, and they're all over the industry in so many different jobs, and I continue to learn from them. So I think that's super powerful. And then, if the employee resource group is healthy and it's being invested in, it also has a key seat at the table with the company. And a lot of companies will ask their employee resource groups for input on marketing campaigns, on company policies, on benefits. So you actually have a seat at the table as well. And I think about, for example, 2020, following the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, I mean, the Black employee resource groups, like all those companies were looking to them, like, what should we do? How do we help? So you truly have a voice. What's hard about employee resource groups is it's a volunteer job. It's extra work on top of work, usually in a period of your career where you're grinding and you're trying to get to the next level. But you will absolutely get what you put into that work.
If you end up in a company that doesn't have employee resource groups, would you recommend starting one, or should you be like talking to your boss about it? What should it look like?
Yeah, if you're passionate about it, absolutely. I mean, a lot of us in those early days, like we pitched why employee resource groups were possible. I've seen many new employee resource groups form, like Faith Force. That was an interfaith group that was created a few years ago. And there's a lot of power in creating that group and even figuring out, okay, how do we build the community? How do we make a business case for the importance of this community? I mean, that in itself is going to teach you so much that is going to be very applicable in your career later on.
Is there a way, would you say, for someone who doesn't necessarily belong to one of those employee resource groups or doesn't have one of those identity markers that might impel them to join such a group, is there a way that someone else who works around those kind of groups can lift them up and support them?
Absolutely. So the employee resource groups are not successful without allies, people who are not part of the group. Like I was part of all the employee resource groups. I'm definitely not part of all those communities, but all of us can be allies in different ways to each other, no matter your identity, and to help elevate diversity and inclusion. And I always say, when we solve for our most marginalized, we're solving for everyone. You're making a better workplace for everyone when we're supporting these more marginalized communities.
Yeah. So you were talking about sort of creating this role that led to where you currently are. So it sounds like you've been able to have a job that's created around your passions, even though it also sounds sort of techie and corporate. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of marrying those two, right? If you're passionate about something that doesn't necessarily sound like it has like an ROI kind of thing, like how can you pursue that in a corporate context?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because if you asked me when I was at Northeastern, I would say I'm never joining the corporate world. That's how I felt. And a lot of people feel like, oh, well, if I join the corporate world, if you're passionate about things like justice, equity, inclusion, then in some way you're selling out. And I mean, maybe that there may be some validity to that, but I also think that you can do meaningful work. And having worked in nonprofits, having worked in journalism, having worked in the corporate world, I think if you're able to be at a company that truly cares and that this is part of the fabric of the company, you could have such a major impact just given the platform, given the funding. I mean, all of this work takes money and it takes someone, writing the check so that you can do this great work. And then there absolutely is ROI as well. For me, it's really about generational wealth. And I think that everyone should have access to the incredible wealth that tech can provide for your generations. And I didn't even know that tech was an industry when I was going to school or growing up. And I came here and people are making insane amount of money. And there's so much knowledge that's being passed within this community here. But these groups are not represented in those communities, so they're not gaining that knowledge. And I believe that we deserve to have that same access to generational wealth and then a seat at the table with these technologies that are changing our society. I mean, think about the technology that's being built here that's literally changing the way that we exist, like electric cars or, and any type of AI or anything that we're using, but we don't have a seat at the table in how it's designed. I think that's fundamentally wrong. And I think that it can be a very fulfilling career to try to change some of that.
So you told us a little bit about your your role and sort of how you're influencing, creating impact and in influencing change at Expedia, and before that at Salesforce. So for someone else who might be thinking about how they can sort of pursue a little bit of diversity and inclusion, either as their actual job or something that they do wherever their job is, where would you say you have the greatest impact if you're thinking about like recruiting new employees, supporting current employees, or things like that? Or do you break it down in those sort of categories of what you do?
I mean, it really just depends what you're interested in. In my role, I get to do a little bit of everything, but that's because I spent different pieces of my career in all those different places. And I think knowing that career paths are not linear by any means, so where you start up doesn't have to be where you end up at all. You know, at first I said I want to be a chief marketing officer, and then it was I want to be a chief diversity officer, and I said I want to be a chief people officer, like, and that's okay. But I believe, and why I'm really passionate about my job, is that part of systemic change is really getting into those talent systems. So how can we take those systems like recruiting or promotions or reporting when something happens to you, and really make sure that equity and justice and inclusion are at the center of how those systems are designed, so that you're truly creating systemic change, not just, you know, temporary change. And so that's the work that I do. But I really encourage you, if you are passionate about diversity and inclusion, there are a lot of internships at these different companies on the different DEI teams. You can also have internships on the recruiting side if you'd like to learn more about recruiting, and then, you know, layering on that lens of diversity and inclusion. You also have internships on the learning side. So if you're someone that loves educating and you're a facilitator and you like public speaking, a lot of companies, or almost every company, has a learning organization, which is how you upskill your employees. And then diversity and inclusion learning is a topic within that. So there's so many different opportunities. Or if you're really passionate about employee resource groups, that's a whole job that someone manages employee resource groups. So there's a lot of different opportunities. If you like writing, there's actually now a whole field on inclusive marketing. If you like writing, design, marketing, comms, that's its own career as well. So many opportunities.
And, you know, that makes me think about, what do you think about, there's in some ways we talk about having diversity and inclusion embedded into every job or like every part of the company, so of course, if you're doing marketing, you should be considering being inclusive as just a core part of what you do. How do you sort of balance that kind of thinking with, no, we do need like a point person to support everything that's happening?
Yeah, so I'm a believer that DEI, like anything else, is an expertise. So you, of course, should have it embedded into everything else, but how do you even begin to have it embedded? You need someone who is an expert. And that is actually a mindset shift that the industry has gone through, and why you have people who are, their careers, diversity and inclusion, and they're now experts in diversity and inclusion. There's an expertise to being able to teach people about bias, or to be able to have courageous conversations, or to understand inclusive marketing principles, or accessibility, for example. So I think you need both. And you don't have to be in diversity and inclusion to integrate diversity and inclusion into your job. And that's also why the employee resource groups are great. If you decide, oh, I don't want to go into a career in diversity and inclusion, but I still want to support these efforts, that's a great way to do that as well.
Does your job entail any sort of diversity and inclusion initiatives that are external facing? So maybe like for Expedia customers, in terms of their access to flights that are free from harassment and they have accessible spaces when they need them. Is that part of your job as well, or is it more internal focus?
Yeah, so that's not my role, but we do have a role dedicated to social impact and those external efforts as well. And when in my previous job, I did lead a lot of those external efforts too. So I mean, that's another piece diversity inclusion work, is the societal impact and social impact, and also your products and customers. There's also product accessibility teams, there's inclusive UX design. So there are a lot of different ways that you can do this work.
So one of the ways that I've sort of thought about this kind of work is, you know, the system that a lot of people are in is sort of broken. If you're an underrepresented minority, or if you're a non-cis man, it can be really hard in tech. And so we need to change the system, right? We need to change the sort of structure of everything. You were talking about systemic change before, but in the meantime, there's people working here and people we want to get into working there. So we have to help them navigate the system the way it is. And I wonder if you could talk about that second thing a little bit while you're on this way to making all this systemic change. What supports people best in the meantime?
Sorry, my dog is like.
No, we need to see the dog.
Okay. This is Prince.
Oh,
He's a puppy. Yes. So, I mean, I think it's really important because we have this vision of what we want the industry or these companies to look at, and then there's reality. And I want everyone to be prepared for reality. I think definitely you are going to be in spaces, like if you are in one of those underrepresented groups where you are one of few or only, very few companies where that's not going to happen at some point in your career. And then especially as you become more senior in your career, it's going to become even more common just because of the systemic issues that do exist. So I think that's where having mentors, sponsors, community is so important, because you need to have that safe space to turn to and people who also understand what you're going through and how to navigate that. And I want to be clear too, your mentors and sponsors don't have to be from your community. Actually, it's really good to have a diversity of mentors and sponsors because they can also help give different perspectives and input. Have a career coach. I think that's super helpful as well to talk through things like imposter syndrome, which everybody experiences imposter syndrome. Everybody feels a little bit like, maybe I'm faking it until I make it, or is someone going to find out that I don't actually know what I'm talking about? Everyone feels that way at some point in their career, no matter what your identity is. I do think it's magnified for people from underrepresented communities because we've been taught for so long that you don't belong here or you're not supposed to be here. And there are all these little microaggressions that reinforce that. I think microaggressions are another one. They're going to happen. I know for women, things like you're constantly being interrupted in a meeting, or you just said something and the man in the room says the same thing. And it's like, oh my God, that's amazing. Like that is going to happen. And I think learning ways to navigate that, to advocate for yourself, to not let your voice be taken away and your confidence to be shook, which is why I think having those support systems in place are really important to work through that, will help you in your career. And then I know we touched on negotiation, but please negotiate. Like, do not make this mistake. Negotiate, talk to folks who have negotiated before so you know some tools around that. But I promise you, your counterparts are negotiating. So don't leave the table. So much harder to get that money back, because when you start from a different place, then it just compounds because everyone only gets maybe a 3 to 5% increase every year. So if you're already starting from another place, that gap is going to be massive when you're a few years into your career.
Yeah. Well, all right. I'm going to tell a tiny quick story about negotiating. So I'm an example, friends, of what not to do. And so I guess I'll tell the story and then Allie, you can tell me like what your advice to me would have been. So this is actually when I was coming here to Northeastern. So on the teaching faculty, we have 3 levels: assistant, associate, full. They gave me an offer at the assistant level. And then the next day, the dean called me and was like, oh, I was looking at your resume. Like, you actually have 5 years of teaching experience. You should come in at the associate level. And she said, give me a couple of days. I'll write you a new offer. And I said, oh, you don't have to do that. That was my reaction to that. Yeah, true story. So I'm a terrible negotiator. What advice would you have for someone like me in that sort of stage of the job search?
Yeah, well, I think doing your research is really important. There are a lot of different websites now that you can look at, like PayScale and Glassdoor, so you can get data is so important, because I believe that you are much more confident going into a negotiation when you have data, because someone is always going to try to say something. In this case, it was great that they were advocating for you, but you're going to walk into situations where a recruiter or someone is going to say, oh, well, this is the most we can give you. And that's just that. But if you have the data and you know that that's not true, you can push back and say, well, I happen to know that the average salary for this role and this title is XYZ. I think practicing, it sounds ridiculous, but this really helps, practicing in the mirror and having that conversation a few times and going through all the different scenarios that they could say really helps prepare you so that you don't go into that mode that we all go into when you get scared and you're nervous and you're fumbling, or you just, want it to be over with. You can fall back and your subconscious can fall back on whatever you practiced. And then don't make decisions in the moment. So anytime someone gives you an offer on the phone or an email, don't say yes or no right away. You don't have to. Always say, I would like to take some time to think about that. So you don't even have, if you're too nervous to negotiate, give yourself some time so that you can come back to it. And every company, we're used to that. We expect you to negotiate. We expect people to take a few days. So just know that before going into the conversation.
Yeah, that's very good advice. So we've heard a lot about everything that you've done. It all sounds like amazing. Is there anything that you still want to do that you have? Do you have like a list? Do you have goals? What do you still want to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll actually show you all something because it's actually right here. Hold on. So I have a good mentor of mine who's just really amazing. And so she makes these vision books or encourages people to make vision books. And the reason it's a book, not a board, is because you can continue to add pages to it as you go and as you achieve milestones. And I think it's really important because it helps you to visualize something that maybe you didn't even think was possible. And when you can visualize it, then you can start to make the plan to make it happen. So I have a lot in my vision book. Definitely want to be a chief officer one day, own my own company one day. I want to sit on paid boards as well. I just joined a nonprofit board for Big Brother, Big Sister, but just thinking about ways to continue to expand my impact and grow, really. So, and your vision book can have both professional and personal commitments. I'd put a page in there about my future home, and I'm now sitting in my home that I bought for myself. So I think it's a powerful tool.
That's really great. And it's 2:40. I know we wanted to make sure we had time for Q&A. Michelle, do we want to move to the Q&A?
Absolutely. Yeah, please type questions in the chat. You can ask anything. And I'm going to jump in because I have a mic. Allie, because you talked about sponsors and mentors, can you tell us, like, how did you acquire these people? How did you build those relationships? How do you use them?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you've probably heard this before, but so much of this is just about relationship building and remembering that people are human beings. And so I think it was lucky for me that I was a little naive in my early career. And like, no matter what someone's title was, I just reached out to them like they were a person and said, I'm really admire the work that you're doing and your career, and I would love to learn from you. Like, do you have 30 minutes in the next month to connect with me? And you're going to have folks that you naturally connect with really well. And you're going to have folks who, it's just not a fit. And you have that one conversation and move on. But if you do have that connection and you're feeling inspired by them, I encourage you to ask, okay, could we do this? Could we have a regular cadence? Can we do this monthly? And then start to see too, it's not just a one-way relationship where this mentor or sponsor is helping you. See if there are ways that you can help them. So for me, I knew I was a writer. So in some of my early mentors, they had really wanted to have more of a platform. So I offered to write articles for them, like to write bylines for them. And so I help them. Then eventually when they help me, it's not just a one-way relationship. So that's what I would encourage.
That's a great emphasis on giving back. Yes.
Yeah, and I want to plus one to something Allie said. For anyone out here who's part of Corey or anything sort of in tech, everybody is human. Making these personal connections is really important. Sometimes in tech we forget that because we do these technical interviews and we think like we need to know X, Y, and Z, and then we get the job. And that's really only part of the story. The human connection really does matter.
People like to help and talk about their story too.
Absolutely.
So Katie says, thanks for sharing your story. Can you share a couple of examples of tangible ways that companies can create inclusive systems in hiring processes?
This is a great question. So there are a few different practices that I've seen work very well. So I'll say the first is we have to think about equity in hiring. So if you just have hiring turned on, applications open, what is going to happen is most companies, most of the candidates are through referrals. Some are up to 60% are from referrals. This is another tip. Always get a referral. If you'd like to get into a company, reach out to people who work there, see if they would be open to giving you a referral. We get referral bonuses if you get hired. So it works both ways. And if a company's main source of hiring is referrals and most of their company is not diverse, we can imagine which candidates are getting through. So one of the things that companies that have been successful here do is they have focused roles on sourcing underrepresented talent and creating processes to make sure that we are measuring and have accountability around that talent getting to the interview stage, getting a call back, not just falling into the black hole of applications. So that's an equity focused process that has a huge impact. I'd say another one is training. So one of the things I launched at Salesforce and I'm now launching at Expedia is around what we call hiring certification and thinking about interviewing as not something that you just get to do because you work here, but you have to be certified on inclusive hiring practices to interview. You have to be certified to know how bias can show up before you can actually start to interview candidates. And then the last thing I'll say, there are a lot of different practices and happy to share more on this with anyone interested later, but feedback. So there's a lot of bias that creeps into feedback. Textio did a great research study on like terminology and how it connects to bias. So for example, women are much more likely to get terms like collaborative, whereas men are more likely to get terms like ambitious. So really making sure that feedback is connected to competencies, to skills, to competency and behavioral based hiring, not just, oh, Allie's great. She seems like a rock star. She seems so awesome and personable. She seems like a great fit for the culture. None of that means anything. That's all based on bias. So actually revising your feedback forms for candidates to make sure it's connected to competencies and skill sets.
And Jose says, thanks for your valuable input. You mentioned you need power to have an impact in DEI. What advice would you give to people in technical roles who are in ERGs who want to have an impact but do not have power in the recruiting process?
So I would say that you have power, especially if you're in an ERG, that is power because you have a community, you have numbers to back you up. So I think if you come together and you pitch some innovations or improvements to the recruiting process, it's hard for people not to listen if it's multiple voices saying the same thing. So even if you aren't directly in recruiting, I mean, I wasn't directly in recruiting until much later in my career, you can still have an impact. And then absolutely, once you become a hiring manager, you have a lot of power to then start to push back, and maybe your recruiting organization isn't as far ahead as it should be, and you can kind of push back and advocate for some of those practices.
Allie, I was curious about just frustrations that come up, obstacles, things like that in the work that you do. I'm sure there's many.
Oh, yeah, I think you have to have a lot of patience if you're going to go into diversity inclusion work. And sometimes you have to separate. I know I personally have to separate, sometimes personally how I feel about something and where someone is in their journey and where the company is in their journey. Because this is truly transformation work. When you're trying to transform culture, it's going to be slower than you would like, and you're going to encounter things that maybe, really bother you, or people may say things that really trigger you. but having that empathy for, okay, this is where that person is on their journey, being able to discern when it's something that needs to really be addressed and held accountable versus this is a learning and teaching moment, or this is just where that person is on their journey and they just need more time. That can be super difficult. And if you know anyone that works in anything that has to do with systemic change or justice or inclusion or diversity, you know that there are days when it feels insurmountable. It feels like, okay, how are we going to move this big system, this Titanic? Like it doesn't feel like it's moving. And then there are days where you feel a lot more optimistic and you actually see that change. And I think it's just balancing some of that.
Thank you. Lisa's asking, because you attended Northeastern, what advice would you give for improving classroom DEI practices?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's been some time, so let me think about this. I mean, I think, you know, from what I remember, I was an RA, so we did talk a lot about inclusion and belonging and those practices as an RA, but I don't remember as part of the standard curriculum us talking about this as much. So I do think that's important, even just thinking about in a classroom, how can you have some inclusive practices so it's not always the same people speaking or not always the same person called on, or making room for people who may be more introverted or people who may have a different experience. I also think having some safety in place, especially when you think about those political science classes where, you know, they can be very triggering for underrepresented people when you're one of few in those classes and you're the one who has to raise your hand and say, I don't think we thought about these different experiences. I think that can be really hard. I remember that being really hard. So taking some of the same principles we use in our inclusive learning sessions and applying that to classrooms, especially those ones that can be triggering, I think would be helpful. And then I'll say, I mean, still, just like any institution, representation is an issue. And so how do we really be intentional about creating those safe spaces and support systems for those marginalized communities?
Okay. And question, are any topics regarding, what are any topics regarding DEI that Expedia is trying to focus on in the future? Also, I was wondering if Expedia is open to sponsoring future employees from different countries and cultures.
Yeah, great question. So Expedia, what I love about it and why I joined is that they're really passionate about making sure that our company reflects the diversity of our travelers. And so we're doing a lot of work right now around, you know, how do we make sure that our products are being really mindful of the different communities that we're serving and have those different perspectives baked in. So for example, we are creating a community called the Black and Well-Traveled community. We also are really focused on accessibility and travel. So how do we make sure we're connecting folks living with a disability to the right places that can be the most inclusive for them? And so those are some of the ways that we are embedding and focusing on diversity and inclusion. We absolutely do sponsor folks from different countries that most companies do. It is usually a longer process, but we do definitely do that as well.
Can you also speak about the role of professional associations and conferences, and what advice would you give to people about utilizing those?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I mentioned early in the call, but I am actually going to Afrotech next week, and we're hosting a recruiting event, and Afrotech is the largest Black tech conference in the US that happens every year. So a lot of companies that go to conferences like Afrotech or Latinas in Tech or Lesbians Who Tech, or there's so many different ones, ACES, and they will actually actively recruit there. So really fantastic, especially if you're early in your career. Great way to meet the companies, to build that relationship. A lot of times you'll be added to their email list so that you will get updates on new jobs. So the tickets, it is an investment, it does cost, but again, I think there's a big return on investment.
And are there any keywords or phrases to listen for when talking to employers that indicate they will be particularly good or bad at including underrepresented populations?
Yes, I could probably write a novel about that, but I mean, I think just the way that folks talk about it, are they saying things like belonging? Are they going beyond diversity and talking about belonging and inclusion and experience? I think that's a really important one. Are they afraid when they say words like race or Black? That's a big sign as well. Are they comfortable? Like so I had an experience interviewing for a company where I asked the recruiter, what are the diversity inclusion practices? And they completely stumbled over the answer. I mean, when it's really embedded in the culture, everyone from the recruiter to the executives to the employees can at least tell you, this is our commitment, this is why it's important to the company. So they should be able to at least tell you why it's important. And I think asking them questions about, okay, what are the actual programs that you have in place? Is it just employee resource groups? Employee resource groups are great, but again, those are employee-led. So what is the company actually leading? So things like leadership programs for underrepresented groups, mentorship and sponsorship programs, inclusive hiring practices, things like that. And when a company is actually doing these things, they'll often publish a lot of that on their website as well. So you can do some of that work ahead of the interview.
There's a very impressive diversity and inclusion report on Expedia's website that I thought it was amazingly detailed, and was really impressed by all the initiatives. Given that, are there some new things coming and taking us into the future that you're excited about?
I mean, I'm just really excited because I've seen this industry or the diversity inclusion world just mature so much. I mean, there's so much more to do, but I just think we're having much deeper, more nuanced conversations. I also think the younger generation is really driving more accountability and, coming to the workplace and saying, I'm not going to accept what everyone had accepted before me. Like, I don't want to sit in a workplace where I'm experiencing microaggressions all the time. And so I think that goes back to power. Like, we do have power, we do have choice. And I think once you get in the door of those companies, knowing that you have a voice, but I also want to make sure that you know your resources too, and that you know how to report. And I think whenever someone hears the word report, it's like, oh, well, I don't want to tell on someone, or I don't want to get in trouble. But if you don't document what's happening, there really can't be change. And I will tell you that we do implement changes at companies based on what is reported. And if it's not reported, then it's hard to say this is actually a problem. So I think, I don't know if that actually answered your question, but I'm just excited about where the industry is going and the different ideas that are being brought by some of the folks entering the workforce now.
Great. One thing I sometimes hear as a career coach is, difficulties that everybody actually has with advancement, but sometimes there may be someone trying to advance in their career where they feel concerned that there's some bias happening, or that they're blocked, or the company isn't supportive. What advice would you have for people who think that's what they're facing?
Well, I think there are a few different things. One, I think, again, knowing your resources and support systems are really important. I will tell you personally that I've interviewed for a company, a prestigious company, and I experienced some bias, underleveling, microaggressions in my process, and I reported it. And I did that so that, others didn't have to go through the same, but also so that it's documented somewhere that it wasn't about my performance. This is the experience that I had. So I think that's really important. I know that's challenging when you're early in your career because you don't want to risk not getting an opportunity. But anytime I didn't say something, I look back at my career and I regret it. So I think that's an important lesson for me. But then also setting yourself up so that you have that safety net, you have those mentors, sponsors, the network. If you have to turn down a job because it's not going to be a safe space for you, that you have that network to turn to so that you can find some other opportunities as well. that you're always keeping your LinkedIn up to date, your resume up to date in case you ever do need to make a switch. That's really important too. And I think just understanding your rights as an employee in the workplace, super important. That is where your power is, that you understand your rights, you understand the resources, you know who to go to, you have advocates. That's what's going to help you.
Great. I do want to mention too, for anyone who is a student, that there's an initiative on campus called NU Place that is designed to be a center to support the career journeys of students from underrepresented groups. And there's lots of learning opportunities and networking and things like that that are available. So know that that's a really good resource. Laney, anything else that you want to add or ask?
No, but I really want to thank Ali for this wonderful discussion. There was a lot of great, wonderful insight and so many wonderful comments from you, Ali. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me, and for everyone listening. You know, add me on LinkedIn, take my own advice. If you're interested, reach out. Can't promise I'll get to everyone immediately, but if you are passionate about this career or field, like definitely reach out to folks that you admire, and can't wait to see what you all accomplish.
And Ali, it's wonderful to hear you make some of those connections to your Northeastern experience, and also wonderful to hear your journey, hear what you're working on, and the significant impact that you're having. And Laney, I want to thank you for being such a skillful interviewer. And thanks to those who came and joined us. This has been really helpful and important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.